this episode, we start by making privacy-focused assessments feel like a practical tool rather than a scary formal exercise, because beginners often hear words like assessment and immediately imagine long documents written for auditors. In privacy engineering, an assessment is a structured way to understand what a system or project is doing with personal information, what risks that creates, and what controls and decisions are needed before harm occurs. The CDPSE exam expects you to know how to perform this kind of assessment in a way that produces useful outputs, not just paperwork, which means you understand how to scope it, how to gather the right information, and how to turn findings into action and evidence. A well-scoped assessment keeps teams from wasting time on irrelevant details, while still catching the important risks that hide in data flows, vendor relationships, and new purposes. A well-designed output helps leaders make defensible decisions, helps engineers implement the right safeguards, and helps privacy operations track follow-through over time. You are not being tested on writing legal essays. You are being tested on whether you can drive a repeatable process that links privacy principles and obligations to concrete controls. By the end, you should be able to explain what an assessment is, why it matters, how it works at a high level, and what a good assessment produces that an organization can actually use. A privacy-focused assessment is often discussed as Privacy Impact Assessment, PIA, and the first thing to remember is that PIA is a method for thinking, not a template you fill out once. The core purpose is to identify how processing of personal information could affect individuals and the organization, then reduce that risk through design choices, controls, and documented decisions. This matters because privacy risk can arise even when no one intends harm, such as when a system collects more data than needed, stores it too long, shares it too widely, or uses it for a new purpose without proper transparency. The exam often tests that an assessment should happen early, because early assessments influence design, while late assessments often only document problems that are already baked into a product. Another important point is that a PIA is not limited to brand new projects. It can be triggered by significant changes to an existing system, a new vendor integration, expansion into new regions, or adoption of new analytics techniques. Beginners sometimes think an assessment is only required for large systems, but small changes can create large privacy effects, especially when they introduce new data categories or new uses. When you retrieve the meaning of PIA, you should immediately connect it to the goal of proactive risk reduction, because that is what makes it a high-value privacy engineering practice. Scoping is where assessments succeed or fail, and the exam expects you to be able to choose a scope that is practical while still capturing what matters. A good scope clearly defines what is being assessed, such as a specific feature, a processing activity, a workflow, or a vendor-supported service, rather than trying to assess an entire organization at once. It also defines what personal information categories are involved, which populations are impacted, and what purposes the processing serves, because these details shape risk and obligations. Scope must include data flow boundaries, meaning where data enters, where it is stored, how it is used, who it is shared with, and where it leaves the system through deletion or archiving. Scope also includes relevant environments, because personal information can be present in production, testing, support, backups, and logs, and ignoring those environments is a common assessment weakness. The exam may present a scenario where a team wants to scope narrowly to move fast, and the correct answer often involves including key flows and vendors rather than only the main database. Another common situation is a scope that is too broad, which causes delays and reduces usefulness, and a mature program responds by narrowing to the actual processing activity and its high-risk edges. Practical scope is about capturing the processing reality that drives risk without drowning in irrelevant details that do not change decisions. Triggering an assessment consistently is another key part of this domain, because a great assessment method is useless if the organization only uses it randomly. Mature programs define triggers such as new collection of personal information, new use of existing data, processing of sensitive categories, large-scale processing, automated decision-making or profiling, new sharing relationships, and cross-border transfers. Triggers can also include operational signals like repeated incidents, audit findings, or patterns of complaints that suggest a processing activity is more risky than originally assumed. The exam often tests whether you can recognize that a new purpose for data is a trigger even if the data was already collected, because repurposing can create new privacy risk and new transparency obligations. Another trigger is onboarding a new vendor that will process personal information, because vendor relationships introduce external risk and require contractual and oversight controls. Some triggers are about context shifts, such as expanding a service to new regions with different expectations, which may change obligations and require new safeguards. Beginners sometimes treat triggers as a compliance checklist, but a more durable approach is to treat triggers as signals that processing has changed in a way that could increase harm. When triggers are defined and embedded into workflows, the organization becomes more consistent and less surprised by privacy risks. Once scope and trigger are established, the assessment needs inputs, and the exam expects you to understand what inputs matter most in privacy engineering terms. You need a clear description of the processing activity, including what data is collected, what data is generated, what data is shared, and what decisions are made using that data. You need a view of the data lifecycle, including collection points, storage locations, transformation steps, and retention and deletion behavior. You need to know the purpose, because purpose defines what is appropriate and what is not, and it frames minimization and use limitation decisions. You need to understand who has access, both internally and externally, because access patterns affect likelihood of misuse and exposure. You need to understand vendors and subprocessors, because data may travel further than the project team realizes. You also need to understand user experience elements like notices and choices, because transparency and consent controls often live in the way the system presents information. Beginners sometimes focus only on the technical architecture and miss the operational processes, such as how support staff access records or how a rights request would be handled for the dataset. A strong assessment gathers information from multiple perspectives so it captures reality, not just design intent. When the right inputs are collected, the assessment can produce outputs that are accurate and actionable. A privacy-focused assessment also involves identifying obligations and principles that apply, but doing so in a way that supports engineering decisions rather than legal debate. The exam expects you to connect obligations to requirements, meaning you can say what the system must do, what processes must exist, and what evidence must be retained. For example, if transparency is required, the assessment should check whether notices match actual processing and whether there is a change management path for updates. If consent is relevant for certain purposes, the assessment should examine how consent is captured, stored, and enforced across processing pipelines and vendors. If rights like access or deletion apply, the assessment should examine whether data can be located and acted upon across systems and whether exceptions are documented and controlled. If cross-border transfers occur, the assessment should examine whether safeguards and contract terms are in place and whether processing locations are known and approved. A common beginner misunderstanding is treating obligations as abstract checkboxes, but in an assessment you are trying to see whether the project's behavior matches the rules the organization must follow. The assessment also considers organizational standards, because internal policies often define requirements beyond external laws, such as stricter retention limits or more rigorous vendor oversight. When principles and obligations are mapped to system behavior, the assessment becomes a bridge between governance and engineering reality. Risk identification within a PIA is not about brainstorming scary possibilities for fun. It is about recognizing realistic ways harm could occur given the data, the processing, and the environment. Risks can involve confidentiality, such as unauthorized access through weak access controls or vendor mishandling. But risks can also involve inappropriate use, such as expanding data use beyond purpose without transparency. Risks can involve fairness, such as using low-quality data to make decisions that disadvantage certain groups or create inaccurate profiles. Risks can involve loss of control, such as collecting data without meaningful choice where choice is expected, or making it hard for individuals to exercise rights. Risks can involve data spread, such as excessive replication into analytics systems, logs, and backups that make retention and deletion difficult. The exam may test whether you can identify risk drivers like sensitivity, scale, and linkage across datasets, because these factors amplify harm potential. A mature assessment describes risks clearly, tying each risk to the processing step and data category that creates it, rather than listing generic statements like risk of breach. Beginners sometimes underestimate internal misuse risk, but a PIA should consider inappropriate internal access and curious browsing, especially when data is sensitive. When risk statements are specific, they lead naturally to control recommendations, which is what makes the assessment useful. A practical assessment must produce outputs that decision makers and implementers can act on, and the exam expects you to understand what those outputs look like. The core outputs usually include a description of processing, a data flow summary, identified risks, recommended controls, and a statement of residual risk with approval requirements. Controls can include design changes like collecting less data or using privacy-friendly defaults, process controls like review gates and training, and technical controls like access restrictions and logging. But the key is that controls must be tied to specific risks and obligations. A strong output also includes a plan for implementation, meaning who will do what, by when, and how completion will be verified, because recommendations without follow-through are not real risk management. Another essential output is evidence expectations, meaning what records will prove the controls operate, such as updated notices, consent records, access review logs, vendor contract terms, and request handling logs. The exam may test whether you can recognize that outputs should be proportionate, because a low-risk activity may need a lighter assessment and a few controls, while a high-risk activity may require deeper analysis and stronger oversight. Practical outputs are written in clear language so people outside the privacy team can implement them, and they remain valuable later during audits and incidents. When outputs are actionable, the assessment becomes a living part of the program rather than a document that is filed and forgotten. Assessments must also include a disciplined approach to trade-offs and residual risk, because real privacy engineering often involves balancing competing needs. Even after controls are applied, some risk may remain, and the organization must decide whether that residual risk is acceptable given the purpose and the safeguards. The exam expects you to understand that acceptance of residual risk is a governance decision that should be documented and approved by the right authority, not a casual decision made by a project team under deadline. Residual risk documentation should include what controls were chosen, what risks remain, why the remaining risk is acceptable, and what monitoring will be used to detect issues over time. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking that a good assessment eliminates all risk, but risk elimination is rarely possible in complex systems. The goal is responsible reduction and defensible decision-making. Another misunderstanding is treating residual risk as an excuse to do nothing, but mature programs treat residual risk as a reason to monitor and reevaluate, especially when conditions change. Trade-offs should also be transparent internally, because hidden trade-offs undermine accountability and create surprises during audits. When residual risk is handled correctly, the assessment supports both project delivery and program integrity, which is exactly what the exam wants you to demonstrate. A privacy-focused assessment is only as good as its integration with the organization's workflows, because integration is what makes it consistent and repeatable rather than dependent on individual initiative. The exam often tests whether you can recognize that assessments should be triggered by product development processes, procurement onboarding, and change management, because those are the moments when new data processing is introduced. Integration also means the assessment output is connected to implementation tracking, so recommended controls become tasks that are completed and verified before launch or before a major change is deployed. Another integration point is documentation updates, because assessment findings should feed updates to processing records, notices, retention schedules, vendor inventories, and training materials where needed. Assessments should also connect to incident response, because a mature program uses assessment outputs to understand what data and risks exist when an incident occurs. Beginners sometimes assume assessments are isolated, but isolation is how organizations end up with assessments that do not change behavior. A mature approach treats assessment as a control gate that both protects individuals and protects the organization from launching risky processing without safeguards. When assessments are embedded and linked to follow-through, they become a reliable mechanism for maintaining privacy principles end-to-end. As we close, Performing privacy-focused assessments like PIA with practical scope and outputs means applying a structured method that begins early, captures real processing behavior, and produces actionable decisions and controls. Scoping is the discipline of defining the processing activity, data categories, populations, environments, and data flow boundaries that actually drive privacy risk, while triggers ensure assessments occur consistently when processing changes in meaningful ways. Strong inputs include data lifecycle details, purpose and use patterns, access and sharing relationships, vendor involvement, and user-facing transparency and choice elements, because these are the levers that shape harm and obligations. Risk identification should be specific to the processing steps and data involved, leading to control recommendations that are tied to principles and requirements rather than generic statements. Practical outputs include clear documentation of risks, controls, residual risk decisions with appropriate approvals, and evidence expectations that make the program defensible during audits and incidents. Integration into workflows and implementation tracking keeps the assessment from becoming a one-time document and turns it into a repeatable control that improves system design over time. The CDPS exam rewards this capability because privacy engineering depends on disciplined assessment that turns uncertainty into clear, auditable decisions that protect people and keep organizations accountable.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.